Hello everyone and welcome to the lecture on AWS Cloud9. So this lecture will contain all these topics. What is AWS Cloud9? How AWS Cloud9 works? AWS Cloud9 environments. What all can I do in AWS Cloud9? AWS Cloud9 pricing. So what is AWS Cloud9? AWS Cloud9 is an IDE integrated development environment that runs entirely in the cloud, providing a complete development environment accessible through a web browser. With Cloud9, developers can write, run, and debug their code directly in a web browser, eliminating the need for local software installation and configuration. Cloud9 comes pre-packaged with essential tools for popular programming languages such as Node.js, Python, PHP, Ruby, Go, C++, making it easy to start new projects without any additional setup. Since Cloud9 is a cloud-based, developers can access their projects and work on them from any device with internet connection, providing flexibility and mobility. Cloud9 offers a seamless experience for developing serverless applications, enabling developers to easily define resources, debug, and switch between local and remote execution of serverless applications. With Cloud9, developers can quickly share their development environment with team members, enabling real-time collaboration and pair programming, as well as tracking each other's inputs in real time. How AWS Cloud9 works? So users access the AWS Cloud9 Integrated Development Environment IDE by running it in a web browser on their local computer. The AWS Cloud9 IDE interacts with the user's AWS Cloud9 environment, which is a workspace where coding projects can be developed and executed. A computing resource, such as an Amazon EC2 instance or the user's own server, connects to the AWS Cloud9 environment to provide the necessary processing power. So under the hood, it will be using an EC2 or user's own server to basically run the environment. You can say the IDE is being hosted on some computer which can be EC2 or your own server. Users' work and projects are stored in a remote repository such as AWS Code Commit or another type of remote repository, ensuring that the code is securely saved and can be accessed from anywhere. So AWS Cloud9 environments. An AWS Cloud9 environment is a place where you can store your project's files and run the tools to develop your applications. Using the AWS Cloud9 IDE, you can store your project's files locally on the instance or server. You can clone a remote code repository such as a repo in AWS Code Commit into your Cloud9 environment. Within the Cloud9 environment, you can work with combination of local files and files cloned from remote repositories. So remote repository can be Code Commit or it can be GitHub also. You can create and switch between multiple Cloud9 environments, with each environment set up for a specific development project. By storing the Cloud9 environments in the cloud, your projects are no longer tied to a single computer or server setup, enabling you to easily switch between computers and quickly onboard developers to your team. So environment is basically if you are working on multiple projects, you can create multiple environments, and this will have its own. One could be Node.js project, one could be Python project, one could be Ruby project. So you can have isolation, and you don't want to like mess up each other's configuration. So environment, you can think of it's a way to separate multiple projects. So what all you can do with AWS Cloud9? So first is very obvious: create, run, and debug code in AWS Lambda functions and serverless applications using the AWS toolkit. So sorry, this is you can do. It's easier to do Lambda functions and serverless applications model like SAM, serverless application model, using the AWS toolkit. So the support within Cloud9 is better and integrated already there. So it's easier to go up and running. So you can work with Amazon Lightsail instances pre-configured with popular applications and frameworks such as WordPress, LAMP, which is Linux, Apache, MySQL, and PHP stack, Node.js, Nginx, Drupal, and Joomla. and Linux distributions such as Amazon Linux, Ubuntu, Debian, FreeBSD, and OpenSUSE. You can work with code in AWS software development projects and toolchains in AWS CodeStar. You can work with code in continuous delivery solutions in AWS Code Pipeline. You can automate AWS services by using AWS CLI and AWS Cloud Shell, because that is also integrated directly in Cloud9. The support for CLI and Cloud Shell. You can work with source code repository in AWS Code Commit, and you can work with source code repository in GitHub using the Git panel interface. You can work with NoSQL databases in Amazon DynamoDB. You can work with LAMP stack. You can work with WordPress websites. And coming to the language support, you have Java and AWS SDK for Java, C++, SDKs also, Python, AWS SDK for Python, Boto library, .NET Core and AWS SDK for .NET, Node.js and AWS SDK for JavaScript, PHP and AWS SDK for PHP, Ruby and AWS SDK for Ruby, Go and AWS SDK for Go, TypeScript and AWS SDK for JavaScript, and AWS Cloud Development Kit known as AWS CDK. You can work with code in a running Docker container. You can invite others to use an environment with you in real time and with text chat support. And finally, you can work with code for intelligent robotics applications in AWS RoboMaker. So AWS Cloud9 pricing. There is no extra cost for using AWS Cloud9 itself, and this makes it accessible development environment for users. So if you use an Amazon EC2 instance for your AWS Cloud9 environment, you only pay for the compute resources, for example EC2 instance, and storage resources. So so under the hood it has to save the file and all. So that is Amazon EBS volume. So that are used to run and store your code. So basic, there is very nominal, like a single maybe EC2 and EBS volume. You can connect your AWS Cloud9 environment to an existing Linux server, such as an on-premises server, through SSH without incurring additional charges. So this is if you want to avoid paying for EC2 and EBS volume, you can have an SSH connection to your own server, and you can use that computing power, CPU power, and you can store the file on your own server. So you can avoid that cost if you want to. With AWS Cloud9, you only pay for what you use as you use it, without any minimum fees or upfront commitments, providing flexibility and cost control. If you create or use any AWS resources, for example AWS Lambda functions, within your AWS Cloud9 environment, you will be charged the standard AWS rates for those resources. New AWS customers who are eligible for the AWS free tier can use AWS Cloud9 for free. However, if your environment uses resources beyond the AWS free tier limits, you will be charged the normal AWS rates for those additional resources. So if you are new users, you get like T2 micro for some computing hours for 1 year or something like that. There is a limit, like total number of hours. So you can use that, but you will only get a T2 micro and some EBS storage. So you can use, but if you go beyond, it will incur some cost. Also, I talked about EBS volume for storage and all. But after you finish your session and all, you can always commit your code to code commit or some GitHub repo, so that your code is safe. So you use for, let's say, 2-3 hours, you have a development session. All you need is a computing power. So you have to run the IDE, debug some code. For example, you are running a Python application, you debug some code. So that will be like a transient storage. So once you are done, you are satisfied with your code, you can just commit your code to some GitHub repo or code commit, and that way you can avoid the storage also. And that's all. Thanks for watching.